Welcome to the Prospective Doctor podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Each week we cover topics related to the pre-med journey to medical school and beyond, from the MCAT to completing your application and from starting medical school to choosing a specialty. Our podcast will provide essential information for anyone contemplating a career in medicine.
Okay, hey everybody. I am super excited to be joined by Travis Hornsby today. Travis is the founder of StudentLoanPlanner.com. He is a former bond trader at Vanguard turned student loan advisor, and I think he's going to have some amazing advice for our audience, all of you med students and pre-meds out there who are thinking about going through the med school process. I'm sure a lot of you have on the top of your minds just how much this is going to cost you, what you're going to come out with in terms of loans. And Travis is going to be able to really give us some great understanding of how to tackle those issues and problems. So without further ado, Travis, welcome.
Really excited to be here, Sal. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So Travis, I gave the audience a brief background, but maybe you could dive a little bit deeper into how you got involved in this.
Yeah, so I thought I was going to be an economics professor, and then I just didn't like abstract math as much as I thought I was going to. So basically I decided, okay, well, if I don't like abstract stuff, I want to actually be in the real world and operating in finance. So I went and got a job working as a bond trader, trading billions of dollars in municipal bonds for mostly very wealthy people. And it was a good job, but it wasn't something that I was super passionate about. And I was in the Northeast in Philadelphia. So, you've got UPenn there and a lot of people there in training for various, medical programs. And I ended up meeting my now wife. And when we were dating, we kind of started to get more serious, had the money talk. And then she's like, oh, yeah, I got 6 figures in medical school loans. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's probably easy. You're a physician. You're going to pay it back. No problem, right? And so I thought, okay, we'll just make a simple little spreadsheet model showing how much we're going to pay. If we pay this much, it's done in 10 years. If we pay this much, it's done in 5. I thought it was going to be really easy, right? And then I found out about public service loan forgiveness and refinancing and taxable loan forgiveness. And I found out that student loans are, definitely not as complicated as medical school, but at times it definitely seems like one of the most freaking complicated things out there. Yeah. And so I kind of was very attracted by this complexity because personally, my wife and I lost at least tens of thousands of dollars, if not a 6-figure amount, because of some bad student loan advice that she received. So, basically, she consolidated some loans and maybe she shouldn't have. And then she also had things set up on the wrong repayment plan. And then also her loan servicer screwed her over and did not count her payments appropriately. So we should have had when I started dating her, she was in her going into her last year of fellowship. And so at that point, she should have had about 7 years worth of qualifying credit towards the 10 years that you have to pay based on your income in order for the loans to be forgiven tax-free. And so for the prospective med students listening to this, public service loan forgiveness, by the way, is just a program where you work for a not-for-profit or government employer for 10 years. You pay payments that are based off of your taxable income while you're employed at that kind of a place. And over a cumulative 10 years worth of credit amount worth of payments, then the rest of the balance that you owe is forgiven without any taxes. So it's a wonderful program. And for physicians, it actually applies to the majority of the physician workforce because most physicians these days are increasingly being employed through health systems, most of which are organized as not-for-profits. There's a couple big exceptions like HCA, in the Southeast is a for-profit hospital chain. There are some exceptions, but the vast majority of these hospital systems are not-for-profits. And so most physicians actually end up qualifying for this if you are an employee pretty much anywhere. So you don't have to be some, $150,000 a year primary care doctor working in some rural location. These are people that are even neurosurgeons in New York City that can qualify for this.
So that's really interesting because I'm not sure a lot of pre-meds know that or even understand that. I mean, certainly when I was going through med school, there was these loan forgiveness programs if you sort of worked in a community-based program at the end of the day. But I actually didn't realize any of this that you're talking about, that you could actually be part of a HCA and that still work?
Well, you could be a part of a 501c3 and it works. And so what is a 501c3? Any hospital in New York City basically qualifies, right? And so if you think about it, like say you're working at I don't know, like Brigham and Women's in Boston, right? 501c3. Certainly some of the top specialists there are making probably tons of money. And so if you had a lot of student loan debt, pretend for a moment that you do a program with a really long training period like neurosurgery, or, you could even say like urology with fellowships, or like, hand surgery, one of these really high income earning fields. Then you could potentially get payments of like $0 to $300 a month because it's based off of your income, your taxable income. And while you're a resident or a fellow, that's fairly low. And so you can get those payments of that kind of level for the entire length of time that you're in training, plus 1 year, because it's based off of prior year adjusted gross income. And so you could, for example, in the case of that, I love using the neurosurgeon example because it just shows how outrageously generous this program is. But you could potentially get $200 to $300 or $0 to $300 payments for like 8 or 9 years, and then have that 1 year of attending level payments of like $4,000 a month. And you can even get this capped actually too. You can even cap the payment if you know what you're doing. And so you could legit pay like 50 grand total over 10 years on any sized loan balance. It does not matter. So this would help somebody going to an in-state medical school. This would help somebody even more if they're going to a private medical school. And the terrible, dirty secret today of the financing of a medical school education is, under current student loan policy in America, there is, for someone that's going to work in a not-for-profit hospital full-time and meet that 10 years worth of service requirement, there's absolutely zero incentive to not take out every dollar you can possibly take out in medical school and literally go put it in the bank or in the stock market, which is absolutely terrifying to say, but that is the rules that we live under currently.
Wow. So it's already becoming obvious, probably for those who are listening, that getting some real sound financial advice is obviously the starting point of this, because I don't think most med students even realize that these options exist, right? It's really like, even pre-meds, we come in with this anticipation of, okay, I have a bill every single quarter of 60 grand for my tuition and board and whatever else is involved. I may have already graduated with $75,000 to $200,000 in debt from undergrad, and I'm just expecting to add on another $200,000 after med school and just kind of be paying that back over the course of the next 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years. But it doesn't sound like that has to be the case if you sort of plan correctly.
Yeah, it doesn't. And in reality, like, if you do go to private practice, then don't get me wrong, like, please, take out the minimum you possibly can, because you probably will need to pay it back. And, what's also kind of interesting is, a lot of times people are like, well, should I go work for a not-for-profit for like a few years to hit the 10, after I'm attending? And the answer is usually it does not make sense. Like, you really want to think of it as, you would never do this for the loan forgiveness only. That doesn't really make that much sense in most cases. You really only want to do this if your plan is to be in academic medicine anyway, right? Or to be in not-for-profit medicine anyway. And, my wife's a physician. She got a couple job offers when she finished schooling. One of them was a very traditional academic medicine kind of job offer, which is what she took. But another one of them kind of paid her more like she was going to be private practice, but it just so happened to be at a not-for-profit hospital. Right? So there's all these like nuances where a lot of times people think they're going to be in private practice, but then they just happen to work for some community hospital that's a 501c3 not-for-profit, and then they end up qualifying for this. So, and there's actually additional loan forgiveness options beyond just PSLF. There's also the ability to have it forgiven over 20 years instead of 10 years if you're in the private sector. And this is for literally everybody on the planet has this option. The catch is if you're a private practice physician, you're paying a percentage of your income on an income-based plan, basically, when you graduate. And if you are at a hospital as an employee, then you do the 10 years, it's forgiven tax-free. But if you're in the private sector as a private practice doc, then you could pay for 20 years, and then you have to pay income taxes on the forgiven balance. So what that means is that really only helps somebody who's like a primary care doctor with like a private school level of debt, because otherwise you just end up paying the full debt off, and you might as well have just refinanced to a lower rate and pay it off. But there's nuances here that people that they don't think about this all the time would miss, and when you miss it, it's extremely costly.
Yeah. Oh, I can imagine. I mean, it's obviously it's super nuanced from the sounds of it. And even from somebody who helps people get into med school every day, all day, like we do at Med School Coach, it's oftentimes these are things we don't necessarily deal with or want to put a lot of emphasis on, because there are professionals like yourself who I think can really just have a much better understanding of everything that's going on. What is the average debt for a medical school graduate these days, Travis? I mean, you work with a lot of physicians. What do you see?
That is a wonderful question. So our current number for several hundred physicians that we've helped personally is about 315,000. So that's the average.
Wow.
And if you think about that average having a very large kind of like a two-humped distribution, right? It's not a normal distribution. You either go to a private medical school or out-of-state school and it's like 400 or 450 grand, or you go in-state and it ends up being like 200, 250. So that's kind of the breakdown. And you've got a lot of the DO schools too that are mostly private that have, in general, much higher costs than the allopathic in-state schools. That might be like 300 probably if you're looking at DO minimum, and then probably, minimum 200 for the in-state as an MD, or if you're doing private, out of state, significantly more than that. And obviously you can go to some of these schools that are increasingly offering a lot of scholarships and, things like that. But that's a very small slice of the total application pie that gets one of those zero tuition scholarships at NYU or something like that.
Sure. Yeah. And obviously, the NYU example that you just brought up is a great one. For those of you guys that don't know, NYU last year got a sizable donation, I believe from an alumnus, that allowed them essentially to erase med school debt for their classes for forever, is what they say, which is to say they were going to pay tuition for all of their med students. Obviously, NYU, already a super competitive school, became perhaps the most competitive school in the country once they said that and had that going. But it really, I mean, from a med student perspective, I mean, this is a true struggle. People go in and they anticipate and they have all this debt, and people do choose specialties based on it, right? I mean, they choose higher paying specialties because they need to go and repay $315,000 on debt on average over the course of their lifetime.
Yeah, and I would say that that's actually not the case, that they need to repay it. And that's where the big information, like logic gap, is missing, because it doesn't make any intuitive sense. But when you think about it, your debt is either debt where you have to pay it back, like in the case of you being a private practice doc that's going to make so much money you just want to get rid of it. Alternatively, it's a tax. And it's a tax because it's a percentage of your income for either 10 or 20 years. And so that's exactly what a tax is. And there's groups out there like ours that help people minimize that hit. So it's like a tax where you're trying to pay as little as you legally can versus as much as you possibly can, right? Sure. And so, then you realize that you don't actually have to go into these high-paying specialties. So we've actually written an article, maybe a little bit unfairly, about NYU. And to be honest, like I kind of savaged the way that they designed that program, because it's very, very poorly designed for what their stated aims are, right? Because they wanted to create more primary care doctors, increase diversity, according to the stated aims, right? And have more people choose specialties that are going to help people. When in reality, the person who benefits the most from that gift is actually a private practice orthopedic surgeon that needs to pay back their debt in full, not a primary care doctor that's going to go work for a not-for-profit hospital that would benefit from PSLF and potentially only pay 50 grand of a 300 grand total balance. And so what was really fascinating from the way they did this, they shrunk the size of their med school so that they could afford this program, so they can make this announcement. So they reduced the number of doctors that are graduating every year. They did that so that obviously that would increase the competitiveness of the applicant pool. So that's going to increase the average, MCAT scores and those kind of things. And we know that when you get that big focus on things like U.S. News and World Report uses to rank the number one medical school, that can often decrease diversity, not increase it, right? Because you're so focused on stats. And then the last kind of point there is they started designing this program in, I think, 2007, 2008, when PSLF got passed. And they basically did not take into account the fact that so many of their students would qualify for tax-free loan forgiveness anyway. And so they could have instead doubled the size of their medical school, created a program that was basically a grant for everybody going into primary care, if that was the stated aim, right? Or to increase scholarships for underrepresented students. But instead, they designed a program that is totally designed to try to rank number one on the U.S. News medical school rankings. and the actual stated goals of the way they design the program. If those are the stated goals of their program, then they've designed it extremely poorly.
That's so interesting. I mean, that's fascinating, and I completely understand what you're saying. I mean, particularly from the aspect of, hey, a lot of these people who maybe were going into primary care could have gotten their loans forgiven anyway through programs like PSFL and others. That's fascinating because obviously the lay press picks it up as, hey, NYU is giving free tuition, we're going to get more primary care docs, but it sounds like that may not be the case.
Well, yeah, and also let's be real, so a group like yours helps somebody get into NYU. Maybe that's a several $100,000 benefit that's worth paying a ton of money for if you're able to help them do that, right? And so if that kind of super competitive applicant gets into NYU and they get what is the USMLE scores that help place residents, right? So if they get, if they have the most competitive applicant pool in the nation and all those people are scoring off the charts in USMLE, is that group going to disproportionately go into primary care, or are they going to choose orthopedic surgery where they can make $600,000 versus $200,000 even more, right? Yeah. And so it's just laughable to me that they think that this is that they can even say to it with a straight face. It makes sense when you say people choose specialties because of because of debt, but I don't think that's true at all. I think they choose the specialties because orthopedic surgery can make $600,000 and the primary care people are only making $200,000. They're choosing it because of the salary differential, and that makes sense. The good news is that even the person that's doing primary care is actually significantly better off than a lot of other professions because we have a really wide window that we are able to see because we advise, basically any professional school grad with 6 figures of debt, and physicians are still much better off than most places.
Really? So why is it that physicians are better off than, somebody getting an MBA for a law degree or something along those lines?
That's a great question. Great question. So here's a couple reasons. So one is nobody needs an MBA to be a business person, right? Sure. So you can be a successful business person without an MBA. And so that's no barrier to entry. So, you're paying tons of money for something that may or may not have actual value in the workplace. So that's the reason for the MBAs. For the law folks, the number of legal jobs just isn't there because you're either making a big law salary where you're working 80 hours a week, or you're working like some family law job making 80,000. So there's not really that, and I would argue that the work environment is not nearly as appealing for a big law person that's working so many hours. And then for I'll give you another really good example. This applies really well for medicine versus other healthcare specialties. The pharmacy, for example, right? So pharmacists used to be a really attractive field to go into. Is that fair? Back when you were trying to decide to go to medical school, that was a popular option?
Yeah. I mean, certainly, I think it's still a popular option, at least among some people.
Among some people. So here's some dirty laundry that they won't tell you from the schools because they're trying desperately to get everybody to sign up. So for pharmacy school, the acceptance rate about 10 or 15 years ago was about 35%. So fairly selective. There was about 40 schools and pharmacists made pretty solid money. Today, there are 3 times the number of people being accepted because there's 130 schools instead of 40. And then the acceptance rate for pharmacy school is about 88%. Which means that if you have a pulse, you can get into pharmacy school now, right? Sure. And so what that's done is it's actually pushed down, earnings significantly, and people are really struggling to get jobs. And so why did this happen? So in the medical world, the lobbying for the American Medical Association and those kind of groups is way better than it is for other professions. They're really smart about capping the number of people entering the profession. Even at conferences like my wife's conference, that's a specialist conference, they just had this big meeting about how do we constrain the number of fellowship spots so we don't create too many peoples that drives down our earnings. So there's a lot of very sophisticated, thinking behind that. And also there's a simple fact that Medicare funds residencies in America. So that puts a cap on the number of residency slots that's available. It's 100,000. And then some of the for-profit hospitals augment that a little bit. But the hospitals are so used to this free money that they want to not pay for residency spots themselves. And so, because of that, you have this artificial cap of 100,000 that exists for physicians that doesn't exist for any of these other programs. And so because of that, it prevents, you can't really be a physician without going to a residency, right? Yeah. And so that prevents all these, sketchy schools from opening up like in some of the other professions and charging people, that barely can, that barely had 2.1 GPAs, charging them $350,000 to become a quote unquote doctor. Like that's the practice in a lot of these other professions right now. And for the medical world, it's still highly competitive. That's why groups like yours exist, because it's so hard to get into medical school, right? And so, that's the big differentiator, is the supply is still constrained. And so even though it costs a lot of money, I would say that, the MD-DO degree is probably still one of the only ones that's still has a decent ROI that's worth borrowing for, although I would not do it for monetary reasons compared to other things.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes tremendous amount of sense. But the last thing you said, I think, makes the most sense, which is that nobody should do and enter the profession of medicine for monetary reasons, because the reality is you're in for a rude awakening if you do. Partly because of all this debt, and partly because of other factors that are certainly driving down salaries and all the other headaches that you have in medicine. But you do it because you really like medicine, and then you kind of deal with all the side effects from it. I mean, you're never going to be a physician who starves. That's just not the case. You're going to make a really nice, decent living, but there are a bunch of other factors, and you can certainly make money in other professions easier than you can in medicine.
Yeah, and the thing is if you're gonna, like you said, like there's opportunity cost, right? Like your 8 to 12 years that you're doing residencies, medical school, and fellowships, like you could be earning so much money doing something else, like engineering, or not taking out all that debt. I mean, financially, it probably doesn't make sense to be a physician compared to using your really smart brain that got into medical school doing something else. But that said, if you're comparing medicine to any other quote unquote stable occupations, medicine's really, in my opinion, somewhat unrivaled right now. Like the only kind of exception might be like you could make an argument for like physician assistants and nurse practitioners from a lifestyle standpoint, because they also can get PSLF working for a hospital. They can really work a lot more flexible hours. They're able to not necessarily have as much stress, like being the ultimate decision maker and the person who's at their core responsible for the patient care. They can make that life or death decision. I mean, that some people might listen to that and think that's unfair, but you know what I'm basically trying to say, right?
Sure.
Like I think that there's some lower stress fields out there in healthcare that still have pretty good ROI. You might train for a lot fewer years. Might be a little bit easier to have a family with some of these other professions. But in terms of the financial aspect of things, I mean, becoming a fellowship trained specialist and working for a not-for-profit hospital and realizing that you have a lot of bargaining power to design the lifestyle that you want is something that I think that is an extremely attractive path still, even with the ridiculous cost of med school, partly because these forgiveness programs mean that the sticker price, after you analyze it, is not really the true sticker price. It's what you pay over the 10 to 20 years, which in many cases is a fraction of what the cost is.
Yeah. I want to hit home on that point, because I just feel like so many people don't understand that as the point, right? And so let's say you're a pre-med student choosing between medical schools, right? And you have your option of, let's say you're a North Carolina resident, you have a fabulous school like UNC in front of you, but you also got into, let's just throw out Yale on there as well. And you look at the tuition bills, what should a student really be understanding about the tuition numbers? Because that's sometimes all you have to go on, right? It says, well, tuition at UNC is $20,000 per semester, and tuition at Yale is $70,000 or $60,000 per semester. I'm making up numbers here, but that's sort of what the student sees. I mean, what do you advise a student to really look at within those numbers or beyond those numbers to make a decision?
Well, sure. So, I mean, in that case, I would say this. If you want to be a private practice physician, prestige matters like zero. I mean, the patient that you're going to work on does not care one hill of beans whether or not you went to Yale or UNC for med school. They care like your doctor, right? Your doctor so-and-so, and you got a good reputation. You do this many of the procedures per year. So if you want to make money, and that's your main goal, honestly, if you're interested in making a lot of money as a physician, I would go to UNC, because that's going to give you the opportunity to easily refinance those loans and pay them down in no time at all. Right. And alternatively, if you want to go into academic medicine and be known as a researcher and get into the very best residency and fellowship programs, then I would go to Yale, because they have a higher ranking, they have more resources for research, and you probably will get maybe a marginally better placement coming out of Yale. And then if you're going to go into academic medicine, you're going for PSLF anyway. So the amount that you borrow is actually not going to be very important if you do go the PSLF route. So I think it really comes down to career decisions. And then I would also heavily look at the placements for med school. So look at the placements for where the med school folks are getting matched into residencies. If you want to match in like a very competitive residency, like do the programs have the same track record of matching people? My guess is UNCEL probably are, I don't know, maybe somewhat similar, or at least I think that, they're probably both pretty solid programs with good outcomes for people. If you compare Yale to, or, UNC to like, one of the DO schools where it's all primary care or a lot of primary care, like, yeah, if you want to be in orthopedics, you probably shouldn't go to that place. And it would make sense to borrow way, way more to go to the place that's got the better placement rate.
But even with the borrow more, if you end up in academics or a non-for-profit group, and as you mentioned, so many groups are non-for-profit nowadays, even if they seem like they're for profit or their physicians are paid like they're for profit, like so many of the groups fall under that category. It sounds like it doesn't really matter at the end of the day if you're going to go this route. Like the PSFL would take care of being able to minimize the amount you pay back.
Yeah. I mean, like, so the only catch is this, right? So PSLF is a thing that is going to be, right now it's solid. It's in the promissory notes. Any of the repeal proposals have said that everybody's grandfathered in while you're currently in a program that you already borrowed for. Okay, so there's been a lot of efforts to repeal PSLF because it's not very popular for the general average, voter who's making $50,000 a year to pay for the medical school education of a six-figure income earner tax-free, right? That is not a popular thing, and it's not really happening in big numbers yet for this reason. The first medical school grads that really got access to direct loans without having to do anything special was approximately like 2008 to 2010 timeframe, really mostly 2010. So if you take 2010 to 4 years later, 2014, add 10 years to that, the first big wave of physicians getting PSLF is going to happen in 2024. And it's going to be kind of an exponential curve because of the way the program got designed initially. So a lot of the people that have looked at this program from Google search will find, things like 99% rejection rates for PSLF. That's because the program was designed very poorly for that first cohort of people that entered it. So the key thing that your audience needs to care about is that this program could go away. And that has a huge impact about the financing decisions and what path you're going to take and what med school you're going to accept. And so what I would just warn people about is you need to look at the promissory note, when you're going to medical school. And right now, everybody that's, signing up in the fall of 2019 is fine. Anybody that, there's not a lot of people that get in the off kind of season, and winter, but, those people are fine. Anybody that's going to med school in the fall of 2020 is very likely fine. What I would be concerned about is if you're going to med school in the fall of 2021 and beyond, there is a lot of uncertainty regarding like, will this program be killed? And if it is killed, it's going to be killed for people who are not yet enrolled. Okay.
Interesting.
So that's a really important point. And that's one thing to think about when you're trying to weigh different acceptances is what is the likelihood that PSLF is going to exist for the full duration of your attendance there. And so that's one reason why it's kind of important to be monitoring this stuff, because you want to make sure that you make that decision with all of the information. And if you don't, then you could easily go to that, higher cost school and then not be eligible for PSLF because it was repealed and you weren't reading Google.
So let's say PSLF was repealed, hypothetically, in 2 years and whatever legislation comes down the line. Like, what other options are there for students to pay down their loans or pay back their loans in a more sensible way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, we have refinancing links on our site, so like studentloanplanner.com/refi. It's got a bunch of the best cashback bonuses and lowest interest rates for refinancing. So the government's going to give you a loan at like 6 to 7% with all these income-based and forgiveness options available. But we know that physicians are better credit risks than 6 to 7%, right?
Sure.
So you can, when you graduate, you can refinance that loan to like 3 to 5%, basically. And so that's the best option for somebody who has a bunch of medical school loans that's trying to pay them down to zero, is just whenever you're able to and you're in a good financial situation, you just sell your loan basically to a private lender that wants to give you a better interest rate because you're a physician, right? And that's a great decision if you are in the private sector, you don't qualify for any of the forgiveness stuff, you make a lot of money. you're going to pay it down in less than 5 years. That makes no sense. No, it's a no-brainer. Sorry, it's a no-brainer to not refinance that. The other kind of caveat is if you are like 1,000% sure that you're taking over mom or dad's like private practice, then there is potentially an argument to take out some private loans for medical school. That is a very limited set of cases where that makes sense, because again, a lot of people are not aware that they might not end up taking that role. They might take an not-for-profit role and not realize it, right? So I really like to discourage people from taking out private loans, but it can make sense for probably like 5% of medical school folks, like a pretty small number of people, right? And you do that, you basically get like 5 to 6% interest rates with no origination fees in a lot of cases, instead of 7% rates with like 4% upfront fees for borrowing.
Mm-hmm.
So like we have a list, studentloanplanner.com/private, that has some private lenders, but I like to discourage people against using those unless they know for 100% sure that they're going to be doing a private practice, paying it down. They just want to minimize the interest buildup while they're in school, right?
Yeah, fascinating. So let's take a step back for a sec, because a lot of med students and a lot of pre-meds and med students, they are solely focused on a couple of things, right? It's number one, doing well in the MCAT, doing well in classes, and getting into med school. And then once they get into med school, obviously getting through med school with all the material. And the only financial thing that they're ever thinking about through this whole process is the debt that they're going to accumulate. What other pieces of financial advice do you have for a pre-med or med student, or even a resident, as they, obviously the resident is now starting to make money? Like, what else can they do? And this shouldn't even be involved with loans, but just in general, what can they do with their money? Maybe like 2 or 3 pieces of advice from somebody who deals with physicians in this situation all the time that you can give them that hopefully will allow them to better utilize their money.
I mean, so I would just say make sure that you invest in taking care of yourself from a mental and physical health standpoint. So just as an example of this, my wife, when she was in residency, got worked a ridiculous number of hours, probably hours that were not, were not legal, probably even at times. And there was this culture of kind of scaring you into not talking about how many hours people were working. So I would say, like, if you need to invest in things like, having healthy food made for you, right? Or, physical, like counseling sessions, or like psychology sessions that deal with the stress and the anxiety, or, those things are worth it. Like going to a physical or like personal trainer. Like, as much as that sounds silly, like the main thing that you should worry about in residency is limiting your housing costs and your car costs. So about, in terms of like things that you need to spend your mental energy on, I don't want anybody caring how much they go to Chipotle and whether or not there's guac on the burrito bowl. Okay. I mean, that literally has no impact on your final net worth and what, you're going to be, sure, how stable you're going to be financially, right? But what happens a lot in residency is people, eat poorly, they don't sleep well, they don't invest in themselves and getting help when they need help. Right. And so then they just put themselves in a situation where there's so much stress. They just feel so depressed, like their relationships might suffer. They don't invest in marriage counseling when they need it. So I guess my financial advice for you while you're in training is do not stress, or even med school, do not stress about the amount you borrow. As a physician, I promise you, you will be okay. I've never had a physician client who has not been set up at least 2 or 3 times better than the median household in America. Right. Sure. I've got a lot of physicians that probably would have been better off being a computer engineer. Okay. But that's not the thing you should worry about, right? We're choosing the medical path because that's the one you're more passionate about. You feel like you're called to it, right? So take care of yourself. Keep your relationships, on the top of mind instead of on the back burner, right? And then just self-care. I just can't stress that enough. There's been so many really highly publicized incidents where people have been struggling with mental health issues, and just, obviously physicians have a much higher suicide rate than the average. So I just want to kind of break that stigma and just tell you that the financial stuff really does not matter. I think people love comparing themselves to their other really smart friends, and that's not what you should be comparing yourself to. You should just be focusing on getting through med school, being happy, and standing up for yourself when, you have a, kind of a dictatorial, person that's pushing you around and not treating you well.
That's fantastic advice. It really is. I mean, taking care of yourself is just so important. Something that we always forget. I can't even say sometimes. I say we always forget that in medicine. When you're working 80-hour weeks on average, right? 80 hours is just the average. Sometimes you're working 36, 48, even more hours than that on a row. You haven't slept. You go to the hospital cafeteria and all they have is fried chicken wings or something like that. That's the only food that you can have. It's 1 a.m. It leads to bad situations. And on top of that, if you're starting to think about the debt and not investing in yourself and not investing in healthy habits and making you the best person you can, it can really lead to issues down the line. Travis, this has all been fantastic advice. Now, you guys have a program called the pre-debt student loan plan, right? You want to talk a little bit about that? Because I think a lot of our listeners may be interested in something like that and could really help them navigate the process.
Yeah. So the simple truth is we mostly help people after they graduate, because that's when you can optimize everything super well and save people a lot of money and reduce the stress, because that's when you get the bill in the mail that says you have to make a payment, which is when usually people freak out, right? But a lot of the people that we worked with said, you know what, it would be so helpful if you had some sort of service before I even borrowed that could tell me not to have my parents take out a second mortgage to cover half of medical school when it could have been forgiven, right? Or make sure that I am making this smart decision about, is PSLF in my promissory note or not? Should I consider private loans for medical school or not? So we decided to create a consult specifically for that. So the link for that is studentloanplanner.com/predebt, just one word, predebt. And you can also find this on our site in the menu under the Hire Us kind of part of the menu. So that's it's right now it's about $300. Thinking about raising that price to $400, but it's going to be affordable for people who are making a 6-figure decision. And so if that's a stress point for you, then I think it would be very helpful for you to invest in that. Or alternatively, just read the stuff. We have a Student Loan Planner podcast that you can find by typing in Student Loan Planner in any place you listen to podcasts. So if you want the free stuff, we have the free stuff. But if you want the paid stuff that's customized to your situation, we have that available.
Yeah, I think this is great. I always tell my students, listen, you're about to invest in a education that cost you 6 figures easily. Take a little bit of time and make sure that, number one, you're doing the right thing. Number two, you're hiring us to help you through that process and make sure that you're taking the right steps to actually get into school. And then I think this is a great add-on, a third thing, which is, hey, you're about to embark on this process. Figure out how you're going to pay for it, how it's going to work. And I think just taking a little bit of time and honestly a tiny investment into a program like yours could really help students make the most of their next 10, 15 years and set them up for success. You guys have heard just how much you can be set up for success versus how many bad decisions you could potentially make if you don't have sort of the right counselor on your side or the right coach on your side in this case. So I would highly encourage students to actually check that out. I wish I had something like that when I was going through med school. I think it could have been tremendously helpful. And I know a bunch of my classmates would say the same. And then certainly once you graduate, for sure, that's definitely necessary, because it sounds like there's so many nuances to this that somebody like yourself understands that you can't always just get by Googling and reading. And I think that a lot of other financial planners who are not focused on this won't necessarily understand it.
Yeah, a lot of people kind of say that they know something, right? But it's kind of like the physician that does one case a month of some complex procedure. It's they're just not going to know nearly as much as somebody that does 100. So, we do probably 100 to 150 plans a month. So we see more in a month than most planners probably see in 10 years. So, it's just basically if it makes sense, great, make the investment. If not, it's fine. We have enough clients. We're happy helping people however you want to be helped.
Awesome. Well, Travis, I really thank you for your time and your expertise. I'm sure a lot of students will have more questions, and Travis is at studentloanplanner.com, so you can check him out there. Obviously on prospectivedoctor.com, we also have a ton of tools, a lot of articles that revolve around paying for school and choosing school, along with obviously getting in and how to be a doctor and all those kind of things that we talk about all the time. But I think studentloanplanner.com is a great resource for you guys out there. So Travis, thanks so much for joining us. I think our audience really appreciated this insight.
Thanks, Sahil.
Our mission is to inspire, encourage, and inform students as you journey through a rigorous and intricate process of achieving your dreams in medicine. Visit us at prospectivedoctor.com and medschoolcoach.com for more essential resources in your medical school journey and beyond.